Welcome to the May edition of First Friday. Today we're continuing our remote series due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the final installment of the academic year 2019-2020. Be sure to be on the lookout for updates about future programming from the Institute on our webpage. Today we'll welcome Dr. Dustin Nash, Assistant Professor of Religion Studies and Interim Director of Jewish Studies at Muhlenberg College. Welcome, Dr. Nash, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
One of the things I wanted to talk about, or where I want to jump off, is your first year seminar. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Muhlenberg's curriculum, we welcome our first years in, and we offer them these seminars that are about reading and writing and thinking. And Dr. Nash's is entitled Proving the Unprovable. And here's the description. While the search for the remains of Noah's Ark, evidence of alien abductions, or the hunt for the Loch Ness Monster may seem unrelated, they are linked as products of a uniquely modern desire for proof. Indeed, modernity has been an explosion of interest in scientifically proving elements of the scriptures, folk tales, and myths that have shaped various people's conceptions of the past and the true nature of the present. In this course, we will question the origin and function of this desire within modern globalized culture. Furthermore, we will read literature produced by authors attempting to prove such arguments, as well as those who challenge their conclusions. In this way, we will discuss the nature of evidence and its interpretation, and think critically about the ways in which we, as writers, interpret evidence in order to make claims and create knowledge. So, Dustin, you are trained in the ancient Near East and Hebrew Bible, and we at Muhlenberg wear many hats in our teaching, but there is always a story to be told. Tell me about the connection between your research specialty and your first year seminar.
My research specialty is the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible, and part of that interest, or what had initially brought me into the world, especially of the ancient Near East, so ancient Mesopotamia, places such as that, was the so-called mythology of those places, and which then led me to interest in the research and theory associated with the study of mythology, which then led me to thinking about the fact that mythology are stories, or are the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves. They haven't gone anywhere, that we tend to think about the modern age as unmythologized or lacking mythology, but all of the critical research would suggest the exact opposite. And as I began thinking about what is one area that I would really like to explore outside of my direct research areas as I was developing my first year seminar, one place was looking at these contemporary stories. I had noticed very anecdotally to myself that it sure seemed like there was a stronger push to try and prove stories that 100 or 200 years ago nobody would have sought out to try and prove. And a lot of these I became aware especially of because they're related to the Bible. And as a biblical scholar, that drew my attention. And one of those areas was young earth creationism. And so I thought I would be able to link the development of my first year seminar with some actual field research at the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, and to then bring in as an additional component, make my students think about how we are presenting arguments. So we don't reach any hard and fast conclusions in my first year seminar. That's what I'm trying to emphasize to all of my students at the beginning. The point isn't that we're going to figure out whether or not Bigfoot is out there, though they inevitably ask me what my opinion is. But the point is to start thinking about why are people asking the questions that they're asking, and to really think that kind of metacognitively. So why are we thinking in the way that we're thinking? Why are we asking questions the way that we're asking them? Why are we presenting the evidence in the way that we're presenting the evidence? Or what do we count as evidence? And what are we not counting as evidence? That's why I try to give them readings from both sides of a spectrum to see them kind of engage with it and balance it and really attempt to analyze it.
And as often is the case, your teaching has led to publication and research. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it was very fortuitous that I began developing this FYS, and as part of that, I submitted a request to get a grant in order to do field research at the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, which I received. And once I was there, what I really wanted were some of my own photographs that I could bring back to my students and have them analyze the kind of rhetoric of space, how these different rooms at the museum were communicating arguments. So just as we would want to study articles or analyze articles or pieces of writing, you can analyze spaces and rooms. They're rhetorical as well. They have arguments. But once I was in the space, I couldn't let it go. I ended up spending in my first trip somewhere around 16 hours at the museum. I took notes the entire time I was there. I took somewhere around 400 photographs of the museum and amassed a mini library of literature produced by researchers at the Creation Museum. I sometimes tell people that I've fallen down a hole when it comes to the Creation Museum because I just keep thinking of things that I want to research with regards to it. And there's so many things to say with regard to the Creation Museum. So far I've published, either has already been published or I have forthcoming studies on the representation of Jews at the Creation Museum and the representation of dinosaurs, as well as another essay that's forthcoming that's on the representation of ancient Near Eastern material culture at both the Creation Museum and its sister attraction, the Ark Encounter, which is a full-scale recreation of Noah's Ark, which is also constructed and overseen by the same parent organization that runs the Creation Museum.
Noah's Ark is the first phenomenon mentioned in your description, and you mentioned the Ark Encounter in northern Kentucky. Can you use that as an example to talk about the kinds of questions or the kinds of inquiry that you can do? How does that analysis go, and how does that unfold in your work?
I'll start by talking about what we do with it in the class, because I bring in various articles produced both by researchers at the Creation Museum and other popular resources that have been presented by people claiming to have found Noah's Ark. And we examined what kind of evidence that do they suggest that would support their claims to have found Noah's Ark. What's very interesting is the most recent major claim to have found Noah's Ark came out in 2010, and it was from a evangelical Christian group from China who engaged in an expedition onto Mount Ararat and found wooden structures above the tree line. And so we watched the subtitled video that was produced by this group documenting their trip. And what we first do is we start thinking about, within the class, as we analyze that film, we analyze what evidence the researchers think are compelling that they have found Noah's Ark. Why do they think that they are compelling, and how are they framing their information? So they want to prove to you, they want to convince you that they have found Noah's Ark. Well, how are they communicating that message? We both try and analyze that, but then also try to get on the other side of that and critically engage with that evidence about why presenting it in that way might misrepresent the evidence or leave out other information that would provide a more well-rounded or more nuanced presentation of the evidence, things of that nature. And I think that's one of the areas that comes in a lot with my research on the Creation Museum, has to do with the way in which information is selectively deployed and framed in particular ways, disconnected from broader networks of information or evidence. That has been really important to my research.
So you seem to also make the claim that this is a product of our age. And I would ask, as we move towards thinking about the contemporary world, when did that age start? When does this become a fascination, either around issues in the Bible, or you've made allusions to Bigfoot or UFOs? I mean,
Hmm.
what is the habit of mind, and when did that habit of mind develop, do you think?
I think the clearest example that I can give is actually young Earth creationism, and the question that I generally ask my students within the FYS is, why was the Creation Museum not built until 2007? That there was no Creation Museum of the scale of the Creation Museum. There were some smaller regional sites that presented a similar message, but the type of research that the Creation Museum is founded on really began in the 1960s. This creation science movement, and then even going back further to find the beginnings of a American Christian rejection of evolution, any kind of a concerted pushback in that way really doesn't begin until the early 20th century. In the late 19th century, by and large, most Christian movements within the United States were working to try and incorporate theologically evolution into their worldviews or their readings of Genesis, if they were going to claim the authority of the book of Genesis, rather than rejecting, say, the age of the earth that geology was proposing, or any of these things. So really, it's only within the past 150 years that there has been any attempt to, and then only since the 1960s, any attempt to prove that the historical, literal historical nature of Genesis 1, which even then I have to put with a grain of salt. I don't think that it is a literal interpretation. So it's a really contemporary movement, and we tend to think about it as a very, very ancient idea that the biblical text be read in a literal manner. But actually, as you and I both know as biblical scholars, that reading the Bible literally is not an ancient way of engaging with the text, at least is in an interpretive mode, where we have allegory and midrash and all these other ways of engaging with the text and interpreting it, which I would not categorize as literal. It isn't a rejection of the literal, but it's also not an attempt to prove the literal. So young Earth creationism very much coming about since the 1960s. Even when it comes to UFOs or alien abductions, we really see that attempt not until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, so very contemporary attempts. And even the idea of UFOs, these things we really need to put into the cultural context of the 20th century and the dangers of technology that was shown by the nuclear age and anxieties over lack of security or the Cold War, and all of these things are wrapped up into claims of UFOs and claims of alien abductions and things like that. And then the attempt to prove it doesn't really begin until the 1970s. So it's very, very recent.
So I want to try to connect because we have two strands going, and I'm sure there's some of our people listening right now are thinking, hey, wait a minute, we're talking in one breath about Noah's Ark and creation in Genesis 1, and in the
Mm-hmm.
next breath, we're talking about UFOs and Sasquatch. But I think that there's something epistemologically that is connected here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some are obviously scriptural biblical stories that are the foundations and the bedrock of religious communities around the world, and others are late night documentaries that we
Mm-hmm.
don't often give too much credence to.
What we're engaging in is a radical comparison, but it's a productive comparison. And it's not to suggest that they are the same thing, but that within these particular communities and within these particular communities of interpretation, they are using the same types of arguments. So they're using the same rhetoric. And then I want to ask why, because I would not expect those things to be the same.
But at the same time, it seems to me that there's something that is connecting them around expertise
Hmm.
and about the ability of different communities to, sort of demonstrate a coherent worldview that is maybe in contrast to scientific, sort of traditional scientific or traditional research methods. Do
Hmm.
you see that connection?
Yeah, it's actually a connection that I try to emphasize strongly to my students in the class. And one of the things that I discuss a lot at the beginning of the semester is that there's going to be the beginning of the semester and there's going to be the second half of the semester. We start with the aliens, we start with Sasquatch or cryptozoology, and then we move into the Bible and young earth creationism and Noah's Ark. And what I try to show them is actually the arguments that are being deployed here in these different places are exactly the same, the attempts to prove. And then when we broaden out from that, what we tend to see are the commonalities that we tend to see are community building and identity construction. While for one group, for even for a lot of my students, thinking about alien abduction is a rather they view that as an absurd claim. For the people that are claiming it and continue to claim it, it is a very important narrative for the community that they see themselves a part of. It helps make sense of the world in which they are living. It's all about creating a counter, a group that is counter to a mainstream narrative and the coherence of that worldview as it makes sense of their own experience. So people that claim alien abduction, they're trying to make sense of some element of their own experience. Alien abduction helps do that. And when they start to claim that, they become part of a broader community, which is linked through the internet, which is linked through conferences, through shared literature, through shared documentaries. So and that's exactly what we see with young earth creationism as well, or other groups who are very adamant about the historical nature of some of these biblical narratives, that really it forms a part of a group and an identity, which in many cases is a counter identity to, or is, they feel it is a counter identity to some sort of other group, which is generally a mainstream group.
So here we are in 2020, and the world is upside down,
Hmm.
is changed. And we see, on the one hand, a dominant narrative that is based in science and based in inquiry by doctors, medical researchers, research communities.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons I thought this was an important conversation for us is that we're also seeing these counter narratives.
Hmm.
Do you see this as being a part of the same trend? Is this the same conversation that we've been having?
I've actually been shocked by how much of an alignment there is between this stream of my own research and teaching and what I've seen develop really in the past 3, 4 weeks with counter narratives regarding the economic shutdown and the COVID-19. They're in multiple different ways, which I think are really interesting. The one is the way in which I see, so in a direct comparison to young earth creationism, which a lot of people, if they're unfamiliar with young earth creationist movement, tend to think of it as an anti-science movement, but within the community itself, it is very much not an anti-science movement. They view that they fully accept that science is a discourse of truth. That is not a question that they are going against. What they view is that they are engaging in better science than the mainstream scientists, that the mainstream scientists are biased and they are providing the unbiased scientific opinions. So nobody's questioning that science is the right way. And I've seen this develop with, I don't see these narratives coming up without some sort of recourse or claim to some sort of quote unquote scientific authority. They find individuals who are claiming expertise in these areas, and that is still important to the counter narrative, that the mainstream scientists are biased for whatever reason. These other scientists have an unbiased look, or doctors have an unbiased look at the data, and they're suggesting something else. That seems to be a really important part of the evidence that is being presented on for a lot of these counter narratives. Another element that I've seen that I think is very interesting is one of the things that I talk about with the Creation Museum with my students when I show them pictures from various rooms of the Creation Museum is that there is a lot of reference to things that have absolutely nothing to do with Genesis 1, or at least a literal reading of Genesis 1. So the amount of signage related to abortion, marriage equality, school policy or educational policy in the United States, all of these things at the Creation Museum is overwhelming, actually, because the young Earth creationist argument has wedded itself to a broader culture wars identity as a strategy to spread support for it. And research on culture wars and culture wars identities has suggested the way that the boundaries, we tend to think of it as two opposing worldviews, but actually the boundary between the two is constantly being constructed and erected because of the mutable nature of identities. By linking one idea with another idea, young Earth creationists have found that they can broaden support for their movement. I've seen more and more that the counter narrative regarding COVID-19 or all of this has become more and more linked to other culture war issues or other groups. And that is broadening the appeal of that narrative. You link it. And so even if you aren't as strong of a proponent of this one element, what you are already a group of, you kind of become a de facto supporter of the other, of this attached narrative as well. So I've seen linking this narrative to the anti-vaccination movement, linking it to anti-big pharma, linking it to a number of debunked conspiracy theories, but the conspiracy theories that continue to have broad followings on the internet, so that there's a kind of online community that can link you in to this as well, some involving Bill Gates. The link between this narrative and the Second Amendment is very interesting. It's one thing, I couldn't help but analyze the images. It's one thing to protest the stay-at-home orders or to protest the closing of small businesses. It's another thing to do it with a semi-automatic rifle on your shoulder. Why? And it's because of the linking between these narratives that it's about liberty and not constraining notions of liberty, so that all of these things become linked in the stories that get told about this and the evidence that's provided. So I've been, on the one hand, disturbed by my analysis, but on the other hand, I viewed it as really powerfully showing the applicability of the things that I teach in my first year seminar. That yes, we talk about these maybe things that some people might view as ridiculous or the kinds of things that you watch on a late night documentary on the History Channel after everybody's gone to bed. But what we're doing when we're analyzing that is we're really seeing trends or activities or the ways humans engage with the world. And we take that model, we play in that arena, and then we go out into the real world, and lo and behold, it's what's happening out in the real world too. So what I'm really hoping is that my students within my first year seminar are seeing this for themselves, that they can look at what's going on and ask those questions about why is this being presented in this way? Why are we selecting this evidence? Why are we presenting it in the manner that we are presenting it? And how is it being linked to identity is a very important element of it as well.
So if you had to look into the future,
Mhm.
New evidence, new science will emerge, new data
Mhm.
points will develop. Surely some of those will debunk some of the claims that are being made, or certainly strengthen the argument that is being made by science and mainstream research. What do
Mhm.
you see happening? How does this play out when new evidence comes to the fore?
What all of my research on young Earth creationism would suggest is that that won't matter. It will be interpreted away. And that really has to do with, and there's another researcher, I wish this was my idea, but it's not, it's Dr. Ella Butler, who has done research on young Earth creationism and conspiracy theories and theory related to conspiracy theories. The capacity for conspiracy theories to, they're originally articulated in such a manner that they cannot be refuted with the emergence of additional evidence. There really is no new evidence that could be brought forward at any point, because the nature of the narrative as it is constructed is already built in such a way as to have reasonable deniability for the people that adhere to it. There is no fossil that can be excavated. There is no piece of biological evidence that can be presented that will refute young Earth creationism, because in the end, that's not what it's really about. It's, by this point, it's been wedded to a particular identity, and people are very, very loath to reject their identity.
Dr. Dustin Nash, thank you very much for spending some time with us. I look forward to continuing to have these conversations around conspiracy theories and evidence and worldviews with you as we move forward into the future. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.